What caused the Civil War, and why were so many Minnesotans eager to join the conflict? Why did the Civil War ultimately become such a brutal and drawn-out conflict? And in really the 50 years prior to the Civil War, you really saw the United States begin to drift apart along geological or geographical lines, I should say, where the northern states were increasingly industrializing and relying on a free market economy. The southern states were primarily a slave society and an agricultural slave society. It was a lot more rural, there was a lot less industry, and of course, the primary kind of income method was these very large plantations that were essentially worked by enslaved individuals, creating, at this point in time, primarily cotton to sort of fuel the need for the Industrial Revolution and particularly the clothing industry, which had really boomed. So that was the one sort of big difference. And increasingly in those northern states, which did not have a large enslaved population, there was an increasing amount of criticism being leveled against the institution of slavery, how brutal it was, how repressive it was. They were, fighting it on moral grounds, on religious grounds, on economic grounds, and more pressure began to be applied politically. And while there wasn't a direct political assault on the institution of slavery itself, increasingly the debate was coming down to whether or not slavery should be allowed in Western states, new states that were being essentially added into the Union. Of course, this played into the role of Minnesota becoming a state, as Minnesota was sort of part of a power sharing deal in order to become a state, along with some southern states to try to sort of balance out that sort of equilibrium on the national level. Increasing, though, it became clear that no sort of political compromise between free and slave states was going to be successful. And the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 really was just the kind of writing on the wall. Even though Lincoln's platform was not directly tied in his first election to ending the institution of slavery, it was dedicated to prohibiting slavery in new states that were pretty much inevitably going to be added into the Union. And it was in response to the election of Abraham Lincoln then, who was really the first president who even gave the first inkling of potentially questioning slavery. That's the real instigating reason why the southern states decided to secede, to break away from the Union and declare their own independence. You can read it right in their own Declaration of Independences. There's a lot of talk about the Civil War being about states' rights and things like that. Well, it was only about states' rights insofar as it was, the southern states' right to own slaves. The primary reason that they put in their own Declaration of Independence was that the North was critical of the institution of slavery, and they felt that it was hostile towards the institution of slavery and was going to essentially get rid of slavery in the United States, so they are deciding to form their own country. They bomb Fort Sumter, and of course in response the Union starts arming for war, and that is the beginning then of the Civil War. So why did so many people, particularly from Minnesota and across the country as well, decide to join in and fight in the war? And for the most part, looking at Minnesota, certainly some people had strong feelings about the conflict. There were plenty of abolitionists, people who were opposed to the institution of slavery, who wanted to see it ended or abolished, who joined up. Some were just interested in patriotism and preserving the United States as it was, not allowing the southern states to just sort of break off and form their own country. But really, for, I'd say, the majority of people signing up, it was sort of a sense of adventure for them, as a way or a chance to get off the farm, to get away from home, to sort of see the country and travel a little bit. Certainly at this point in time, they really did not know what was in store for them or how long, drawn out, or bloody the war would be. Both the North and the South really thought that it was going to be a very short conflict. They didn't realize the impact of some of the technological changes that had occurred in the last 30 to 50 years was going to have on the conflict, and sort of how how brutal it was going to be. And along with just sort of, people wanting to go out for these various reasons, I'd say the last reason was probably a decent amount of just peer pressure. It wasn't uncommon for entire towns of, all young men the same age to sign up together and to go off to war. And you certainly did not, in that case, want to be the one person who says, I don't know, guys, I don't really feel like it. I don't really want to go. Lots of social and peer pressure to go along, and if you are of sort of the age to go and fight, to go off and do that. So a lot of varying reasons and motivations why people decide to fight in the war and in the conflict, and a lot of illusions about what the kind of war was going to be like. So why did the Civil War ultimately become such a brutal and drawn out conflict? Well, both the North and the South both had their own advantages going into the conflict. Most of the advantages were on the side of the North. They had the larger population, they were more industrialized, they had an established army, they had far more manufacture and productions of uniforms, of weapons, they had a stronger economic base, so most of the advantages were in the North. Southern advantages, the biggest thing that's going to keep them in the war and keep the war going for the longest time is they have some pretty good generals. Generals like Robert E. Lee, like Stonewall Jackson. They, particularly in the Eastern theater of the war, are going to have an advantage for a number of years. Which is going to sort of keep the war going. Also, because they're oftentimes fighting in their own home sort of turf, they're going to have a little bit, more knowledge of the terrain, a little more easy time maneuvering. And as the war draws on, one of the technological impacts is really going to give an advantage to people defending entrenched positions and people on the defense. And increasingly, as the advantages of the North start coming into play, the South is increasingly going to have to rely upon a defensive war strategy, which the technology is actually going to benefit them. And that's another reason why they're ultimately going to be able to hang on for as long as they do. The last reason, really, that the war becomes so brutal and drawn out is that technology aspect that I mentioned before. Technology like rifling muskets, mini balls, Ironside ships, grape shot, this new sort of cannon shot that was used. But the biggest was just sort of rifles that were more accurate at a longer distance. Was very much not considered in the military tactics. Most of the tactics that were being used were primarily from the Napoleonic War era, studying European wars. Some had been learned in the Mexican-American War, but there was no perception of how these more accurate weapons were going to be impacting the war. So the tactics of the day were still to sort of form into really tight low formations and march across an open field at your opponent until you're really close together, and then just open up and fire. And when you have guns that aren't terribly accurate, that's one way to do it. It was effective in certain conflicts and wars. But now in the Civil War, when the weapons are a lot more accurate and can be shot from much farther distance with lethal effect, essentially it just turns into a bloodbath, with both sides marching in close formations, close together, and then just mowing each other down. Artillery had improved. And tactics of really finding ways to sort of rip those formations apart in short order led to it being a very drawn out and brutal and bloody conflict. Describe some of the roles that Minnesota played in the Civil War. What are some of the most important impacts that Minnesotans had on the conflict? A lot of people pointed out that Alexander Ramsey was sort of conveniently in Washington at the onset of the war and was the first governor to volunteer troops to the fight, even though you sort of volunteered the 1st Minnesota, even though the 1st Minnesota hadn't really been formed yet. People mentioned Fort Snelling, the role that it played in training soldiers and sort of bringing the new, fresh recruits to a place to get equipped and armed. And in the end, Minnesotans pretty much fight in all theaters of the war. Sort of the most famous regiment was the 1st Minnesota. That was fighting primarily in the eastern theaters of the war. So they were fighting in the battles of Manassas, Antietam, and Gettysburg. And particularly Antietam and Gettysburg were very, very important conflicts in the war. The victory at Antietam essentially protected Washington from a Confederate advance, and also gave sort of the political cover that Lincoln needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And Gettysburg was really the sort of watershed moment of the conflict. That marked the last time that the Confederates were ever able to seriously launch an offensive into the North. The losses that they suffered at Gettysburg really hurt because they had a smaller population than the North and just were not able to resupply the troops that they had lost in that battle. And in the Battle of Gettysburg, the 1st Minnesota actually does play a pretty important role. They sort of charge forward to fill in a gap in the Union lines that was in danger of collapsing, which potentially could have been sort of another big kind of break in the Union lines, which the Confederates had used time and time again to kind of rout the Union. But despite suffering incredibly high casualty rates, some of the highest of the war, the 1st Minnesota was able to delay the attack just long enough for reinforcements to come up. And who knows if it hadn't been for the Minnesotans, if what might have happened or what might not have. The Union still had pretty good terrain and positioning in the battle, so it's likely that they might not have completely broken if that would have happened. But certainly, the sacrifices of the 1st Minnesotan made it much easier to maintain the line, and eventually that becomes one of the huge turning points of the battle. Another big turning point in the war were essentially the Western Theater in general. That's where Ulysses S. Grant first sort of makes his mark, and the 2nd and 3rd Minnesota were fighting primarily in the Western Theater. So battles like Shiloh, Vicksburg, which essentially cuts the Confederacy in two by taking the Mississippi River, and finally going along with Sherman and his sort of march through Georgia to the sea to try to sort of break the will of the Confederacy and put an end to the war. People also mentioned that Minnesotans served in the Navy. Minnesota women served as nurses and played other sort of important roles, and certainly were very active in supporting farms and businesses and people's livelihood when people were away at war. And also, of course, 150 black Minnesotans formed their own regiment and fought in the war and the conflict as well, in the effort to sort of end slavery and oppression. So yeah, it was a very multitude of ways that Minnesotans fought in and participated in the war and in the conflict, and ultimately end up having some pretty important impacts. What aspects led to the deterioration of relationship between the Dakota and the United States in the lead up to the U.S.-Dakota War? In the end, what factors did the Dakota take into account when deciding whether to fight or stay neutral? And you can go back and really look at the process that took place as far as increasingly claiming more and more land from the Dakota. The process of either treaties that were negotiated, such as the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, or subsequent treaties where essentially there was more and more pressure, more and more settlers moving into the land, and the Dakota were more or less sort of strong-armed into signing, giving away more land, and eventually, by the time of the outbreak, they're limited to a small reservation kind of along the banks of the Minnesota River in western Minnesota. And quite honestly, this was just not enough land for them to, continue the way that they'd always, lived. Some of them tried to adopt agriculture, but it wasn't great land without industrial farming tools or techniques. There also just wasn't enough land to provide food for all the people, and there wasn't enough hunting land or hunting ground to provide enough food. And the payments that were supposed to be made by the U.S. government, particularly for supplies that the American Indians were going to need with winter coming, the annuity payments got hung up essentially in Washington, and they were squabbling over how they wanted to make these payments. So the supplies were essentially very nearby the reservation. The traders actually had them who would trade with the American Indians, but they refused to release those supplies until they received their money from the government. And there was a real fear that a large percentage of the Dakota people were going to starve over the winter. They just didn't have enough food. And to exacerbate the issue, there was a story that Andrew Merrick, who was one of these traders who had these supplies locked up, when sort of pressured to release them, essentially said, let them eat grass, referring to the Dakota. It's allegedly something that he said, and he eventually is killed in the conflict, and grass is stuffed in his mouth. So certainly there were Dakota people who took that claim, or that he said that very seriously. Um, but it really shows you that the Dakota had arrived in a very desperate situation, which they were essentially forced into by the government. This all is going to be happening when sort of four young men who are out hunting get into an altercation with some white settlers. The white settlers end up being killed, and those four young individuals run back to their village and essentially seek support from from the chiefs of their tribe. And it's important to note that the Dakota here aren't one people or one nation in the sense that there wasn't one person making all the decisions. There were several different leaders of several different groups and tribal groups, and they all sort of had to make a decision separately on what to do. Some, including Little Crow, who is one of the most prominent chiefs, decide to opt for war. And to try to fight back, realizing that because these white settlers had been killed, there was going to be some sort of military retribution regardless, and figured, well, we might as well take the initiative. But of course, many decide to stay neutral in the conflict as well, and even a lot of them, the Dakota who did not join the war effort, end up helping white settlers who were displaced or targeted in the war. So a lot of the Dakota come to different stances on the conflict, and there's a lot of issues that sort of go into determining why or how they made this decision. A lot of them, who decided to go for war, there was a sense that it was kind of now or never, that their land had increasingly been stripped away from them until they practically had nothing left, and they realized that the United States was in the middle of this large civil war. And that if there was any time that you were going to be able to fight back, this would be it, when the attention of the government was somewhere else while there was this internal conflict going on, so that maybe, just maybe, the Dakota could fight back, reclaim some of their land, and carve out some territory that they had previously owned. Also, there's a real sort of warrior mentality going on with a lot of the Dakota, who had very strong traditions of being warriors and fighters, and they really just sort of felt that it was better to die fighting than starving to death on a reservation. And of course, this also leads into all the pent-up anger and frustration that had been building for several decades at this point over the treatment that they had been receiving from their interactions with the United States, through the treaty and the strong arming of that, through the delayment of these payments, the U.S. government not paying them what they had agreed to in the treaties, and really having no recompense, no way to try to fight back other than picking up weapons and physically fighting. A lot of the Dakota who decided not to participate, though, really saw it as a winless proposition. They realized that there was no military chance really that the Dakota were going to succeed, and that it was only going to come back to sort of harm the Dakota people in general. And also, some of the Dakota did make the distinction between the white settlers who were primarily in the path of the war and the U.S. government, realizing that these sort of newcomers to the area, a lot of them who were recent immigrants, were not the ones necessarily responsible for the negotiations. They weren't the ones responsible for the conflict, and that it would not be easy to necessarily directly go after military targets because there just simply weren't any or weren't very many around in the area, and you really have to get to Fort Snelling to really get to a strong sort of symbol of the U.S. government, which was quite a distance away, and certainly there was going to be a pushback and reprisal before the war actually got that far. So these are some of the things that were going into this decision, but it's important to note that there was really no good decision to make here on the part of the Dakota. That to a certain degree they were darned if they did and darned if they didn't. And I think you can certainly see the perspective of those who opted for war and those who did not, to try to at least salvage somewhat of their traditional way of life, somehow help out their people, even though in the end, of course, it is going to cost them pretty dearly and pretty significantly in the retributions after the war. What do you see as the five most important consequences of the U.S.-Dakota War? Certainly, as a lot of people pointed out, it would be the loss of life. The fact that many white settlers were killed, many of the Dakota ended up being killed, and that it really becomes a tragic event because primarily the white settlers who were being targeted in the communities, generally, even though they were oftentimes sort of encroaching on land that had been American Indian or still currently was, they were not aware of the long-standing history of the negotiations and did not realize, what was necessarily coming. The Dakota, for their part, we went through all the reasons that they had gone into for deciding to declare war, but somewhat of their, ambitions was a misdirected hostility, targeting sort of the white settlements around there rather than sort of any vestige of the U.S. government, which is what they really had the issue with. Ultimately, this is going to lead to the end of the various treaties, and at the end of the conflict, of course, the government and the forces of Minnesota are going to be victorious, and it's going to lead to essentially the warriors who are not killed or captured in the conflict fleeing the state, and the rest of the Dakota population being rounded up and placed in that concentration camp in at Fort Snelling, where a large percentage of them are going to die from exposure or starvation or disease. A lot of them are going to be targeted for assault and victimized by sort of the white communities in the area until they're eventually essentially put onto steamboats and shipped out of the state. And that really there was this effort to completely abolish the Dakota from the state in general. Along with the Ho-Chunk, who had no part in the war whatsoever. Essentially, they were on valuable land that settlers wanted, so they just decided to remove them from the state as well. The Ho-Chunk were just sort of a separate American Indian group that had been placed on a reservation sort of in central Minnesota. And as I said, even though they were in no way, shape, or form involved in the conflict, they were still being targeted. People also mentioned the execution in Mankato, the largest execution in Minnesota history of over 30 individuals, and how the trial to determine who should be found guilty and not were not very thorough. Some of them lasted as short as 5 minutes. There's evidence that people were sentenced to death who just because they had the wrong name, they had the wrong the same name as someone who participated in the war, and it really did not seem like the government was overly concerned about which American Indian they killed, as long as they killed a lot of them. Of course, Abraham Lincoln commutes the sentence of the vast majority of them. Originally, 300 some were sentenced to death, and commutes it down to, I believe, 33. But still, another dark sort of period in our history, and the fact that that's sort of the largest mass execution in the history of the United States. And really, in general, the conflict led to long-lasting racism and resentment towards American Indians in the state. This is kind of evidenced by laws offering bounties to kill American Indians who are found off of their reservations. Where it was essentially for a period of time legal to murder American Indians in the state. And that some of those laws didn't actually get taken off the books until I believe the 1970s. And yeah, I mean, even up to this day, there's long-standing racial and cultural issues and resentments that have been brought up between the two sides because of this conflict, which is why I think it's important to think about it and look at it from the various perspectives. And that's really what our next question is going to be looking into, sort of the historiography of the war and how it has sort of changed throughout time. Based off the William E. Lass article, Histories of the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862, in what ways was the interpretation of the war changed over time? Which versions does Lass find most accurate and why? Yeah, and this is a good article really looking at the historiography of the conflict and sort of how the perception of the war has changed over time. The first accounts of the war, of course, are written down by white historians or authors, even if they weren't historians, some of whom who had actually participated in the war. And unsurprisingly, you see these accounts very much funneling the sort of anger and resentment of sort of the white community in Minnesota against American Indians. They were primarily focused on the aggression of the Dakota and really sensationalized the stories of atrocities, some true, some untrue. But that seemed to be the main focus, trying to sort of depict what an awful thing the American Indians had done. These authors were authors like McConkie, Bryant, and Murch. They were sort of the first wave of authors writing about the conflict. As time goes on, though, you start seeing, with the time passing, the passion sort of dying down a little bit, and the next kind of wave of authors do a little bit more research into the causes of the conflict. There's more interviews. These were still primarily taking kind of the white settler perspective of the conflict. But there was, like I said, more looking at the causes. Why did the Dakota actually engage in the war, as well as looking at some of the aftermath of the conflict and how the American Indians were very much, sort of targeted after the outbreak to the point of essentially being completely driven out of the state. So these authors with authors like Burgold and Buck sort of brought this perspective. But the accounts that Lass finds the most accurate are the ones that try to bring the most objectivity and sort of question those very early accounts and rely on essentially much better research and materials, trying to look at the war as a more complex event where, like I said, there's causality. There's reasons the Dakota decide to attack. There's a reason that they attack the people that they do. There's a reason that how and why the Minnesotans fight back, the white Minnesotans, and that in a lot of ways it was a attempt to try to at least see the perspective and bring in the perspective of the Dakota and try to sort of give it that balance where earlier accounts really did not necessarily have that. So authors like Holcomb or Falwell or Carley definitely sort of fall within this range. And I think that's really, if you're looking at history, kind of the process you go through. Oftentimes, immediately after an event, there's a sort of a knee-jerk reaction. But through time, with more research and sort of looking at an event from different viewpoints and different perspectives, you can come to a better understanding. And that understanding oftentimes is going to lead you to the conclusion that this isn't a scenario of it's the good guys versus the bad guys. It's a complicated story where there's good and bad, on both sides, and ultimately it's just a tragic story of sort of abuse and oppression and retaliation and genocide that is certainly a very sad chapter in the history of Minnesota. All right, moving on to our discussion question here. Based on the first two letters, what was the mood of the soldiers and the civilians prior to the Battle of Manassas? Overall, the class did a very good job of pointing out that certainly there was a mood of general sort of optimism between a lot of the civilians and the troops, a lot of cheering and well-wishing until they start getting to the portions where a lot of the population was not in favor of the war, and he said, the women are giving them sort of dirty looks, and someone yelled something about Jefferson Davis, and you could tell that it was a little different attitude when they got closer to where the action was going to be taking place, and certainly there was not as much support for the war. But certainly early on, you could tell that there was a lot of, almost like a celebratory avenue of handshaking and kissing goodbye before they left the state, and sort of the people that they encountered along the way. And certainly, you sort of had the sense that he kind of felt like he was on an adventure through the whole course of the recordings, and certainly it seems like he did not really know what was in store for him or the others. Otherwise, they certainly would not have been quite as cheerful or optimistic. You wouldn't think. Does Jasper Searles give any clues regarding his feelings on the conflict? Based on these letters, why do you think Jasper and other young men from Minnesota volunteered to join the military? Well, he certainly seems excited about the war, right? And it certainly seems like he likes the attention that he is getting from the crowds and the interaction. He likes the travel portion of it, right? He puts in a lot of details about all their traveling maneuvers and all the new places that he is seeing. Also, you can certainly see he likes the idea of getting paid, right? He's very very conscious about looking forward to when he's getting his compensation. So you can see that that's probably another reason why he's deciding to join up. Um, a lot of people did a good job pointing out that you don't get a real strong sense that he was super ideological, right? That it didn't seem like the conflict was particularly to him about emancipation or slavery or about preserving the Union. He doesn't really bring those ideas or the perspectives up. And you can see that while those may have been factoring in, it seems like that wasn't necessarily where his motivations were. And like most young men, it seems like he volunteered because it was the thing to do. It was like he said, kind of an adventure. He's got a chance to travel, to see the world. He liked like I said, the prospect of the pay. And it seemed like it was sort of more of those motivations rather than those sort of deep-seated ideological issues that were separating the country that prompted someone like a Jasper Searles to go off to war. So how does Mr. Searles portray the Battle of Manassas? What are his thoughts on the battle after the fighting is over? Yeah, and Jasper gives a very detailed account here of the First Minnesota, of their movements, their place in the battle. He does a good job sort of depicting the chaos of the battle and how they get sort of very close to an enemy formation that's sort of saying, we're on your side, before they open fire on them. As you can tell, it was definitely sort of a chaotic battle, especially after the formations break and other Union regiments start retreating. And essentially, they sort of have to be shouted at in order to turn around and leave and retreat. And that you can certainly tell that there's some embellishment going on here as well. He certainly plays up the numbers of the Confederate Army. The Confederate Army was nowhere near the size that he sort of reports it on as being. Also, he's very much letting you know that they were in the sort of the most important part of the battle and right in the middle of it, and in the most sort of dangerous position that there was. And also he brings out the fact that he thought that they could have won or been victorious if the retreat hadn't been ordered. And that's going to be a sentiment that's going to be sort of echoed with the Union Army. And sort of the biggest challenge that the Union Army is going to have, particularly on the Eastern Front, is trying to find the right generals, because they go through a number of them who aren't terribly successful and don't instill a lot of confidence in the soldiers, or when they do, aren't very effective generals. And you can tell it right off the bat. There's some grumbling about how the war effort was being conducted. Also, after the battle, he definitely gives the idea that sort of the idea of the short war was past, right? Realizing this was going to be a much more longer, drawn-out conflict than he had sort of initially been hoping for. But he still seems rather optimistic, right? You can tell that there's sort of this adrenaline rush, and he was, of course, noting the large casualties that had occurred, but was very glad that he had not, and sort of promised he was going to try to stay safe moving forward. So, yeah, a pretty good depiction of what the battle would have been like. As one person sort of pointed out, it was very impressive seeing as how kind of crazy things must have been to sort of remember all of that to then later write it down is pretty impressive in its own right. So question number 4, what aspects of these letters did you find the most interesting and why? Yeah, this class did a very good job of picking out the kind of details that they thought were interesting. A lot of people just thought that general mood and attitude of the soldiers was very interesting. The amount of detail that Jasper wrote with, a lot of people liked, and how much he liked to put in sort of those little details of the places that he went to. His interest sort of in geography and sort of tracing the routes that he went on, the places that he was able to visit. And a lot of people sort of liked the little details that he added in, like the men being disappointed in Colonel Gorman because he couldn't control his horse during the battle. That was sort of was a negative light on him. His impressions of Washington, he wasn't super impressed with the capital at this point in time, and he seemed more impressed with his journeys through Pennsylvania and Ohio and other states that they had gone through. or kind of that focus on his pay, how sort of eager he was, and how he kept writing about it in all of his letters. So yeah, I think the class did a very good job of picking out a lot of the sort of interesting aspects that these letters can tease out and bring out, and definitely gives you a good perspective of what it would have been like for a young man to go off to war and to fight in one of these conflicts, and sort of see his perspective and attitude and how it's changed to a certain degree towards the end. And certainly that attitude was probably not going to be as optimistic as the war is going to go on, as he's in several more battles like this before the end. But certainly at the end of the war, a lot of these soldiers are very proud of their service as well. And a lot of them returning to civilian life do end on going on, like Jasper here, to fill important roles in government and in their communities. So interesting for them to look back and to publish these journals and letters after the war.